There couldn't possibly be a better endorsement for a product than this. The President of the United States of America uses it. Even more, refused to give it up when told to by the Secret Service. Even Oprah said it changed her life. Yes, those were heady days for BlackBerry. Sadly, the Waterloo-based company has fallen on much harder times, and all of it is chronicled in Losing the Signal, the spectacular rise and fall of BlackBerry. It won the National Business Book Award for 2016, and one of its co-authors, Jacquie McNish, joins us now. Nice to have you back here at TVO.
Good to be here, Steve.
Let's start with the two guys who are at the center of this drama. Jim Balsillie, you describe him as a two-headed demon, positive force of ambition versus a deep-rooted distrust of authority. How did he get involved?
Jim comes from Peterborough and had that restless desire that the young business wannabes have, which is to be in the Canadian establishment. He actually read Peter Newman's The Canadian Establishment, figured out that you went to Trinity College, you went to work for Ernst & Young, and then you went to do your Harvard MBA, all of which he did. And he was plotted to go to Wall Street and realized that as a young kid from a working class family in Peterborough, it was going to take him 10 to 15 years to work his way to the top of a Goldman Sachs or any other place. And he met a technology guy from Southern Ontario, Waterloo, Sutherland Schultz, Rick Brock, who said, I can make you a senior executive right away. You've got what it takes. And what he realized, that the key for someone like him who didn't have the blue blood connections that existed in the Canadian establishment, which was very clubby at the time, that technology was going to be his ticket to success. Because if he backed the right thing, he could rise to the top really quickly.
Well, the guy he backed was a guy named Mike Lazaridis,
right,
who, funnily enough, dropped out of university just weeks before graduating to create RIM. What did his parents think of that?
I don't think they were too happy, but this is a man who had been in the laboratory, they called it his lab in his basement, that his father had made for him in Windsor, Ontario. And his burning ambition since high school was to create something that married radio frequencies with computing. And he had a teacher in high school, Mr. Machinsky, who said, the person who can marry these two things is going to be a huge success. So he was on the path making mobile modems for a variety of applications, and he was working at that point selling to Sutherland Schultz, Jim Balsillie's company that he was working for, these modems that were used on the shop floor in a variety of factories. And Balsillie came to him and did what he did best, tried to squeeze him to lower the prices so they could make more money. And Mike Lazaridis looked at Jim Balsillie and said, I need you. I want you to be my partner. But before I let you do that, you have to meet my wife, Ophelia. She was then his fiancée. They had dinner. Ophelia and Mike walk away, and Ophelia says, he's a shark. And Mike says, but he's my shark. And he needed him because he was not a business person. He was an inventor and innovator.
So let's understand that. What were the complementary skills that these two brought to each other?
Mike was the great innovator who was moving down that track of marrying computing and radio frequency with an eye to creating mobile data communications. Jim was a dogged salesman, a very smart businessman who really, really knew how to outsmart bigger forces. And his great gift to the early days of research in motion was basically defeating big companies that were squeezing them, trying to take advantage of them, from Palm to US Robotics, making big orders, then canceling it. And Jim outsmarted tougher, bigger guys to get what he wanted so that research in motion could sell these devices and build a bigger market share at a price that they could stay alive.
Were they friends?
I don't think they were ever friends. They were very close as business partners in the early days, so close that they would sit at a table like this side by side, and they had a signal. They'd nudge each other in their knees under the table if it was time to leave the room, and they understood their roles very well, but they never socialized. They had nothing in common.
They eventually come up with the product that I still use. Do you still use it?
Absolutely. I've got the BlackBerry Classic.
Okay, good. The BlackBerry. BlackBerry was apparently the 40th name, you tell us, that they considered. Why did it take so long to get to that?
Well, Mike had a really sort of fatherly approach to technology. He didn't want it to be intimidating. He wanted it to be friendly. He named one of his first applications after a bird. And he hired, at this point they were doing quite well when they were moving into actually launching the BlackBerry in '98. They hired a California firm that came up with a list. And as you do when you're in the business of naming, save your best one for the last. So they went through a lot, Pocket Link, which the engineers liked, Blade, which Jim and his team liked, and a bunch of other things. And at the end was BlackBerry, this friendly little fruity name that happened to have the keys that were similar, you could say, to the pods on a BlackBerry.
Why didn't Blade make it?
Blade didn't make it because
Jim loved that one.
Jim loved it, and Jim usually managed to get his way on these things. Mike phoned the name expert in California, and he said, Mike, I'm going to do something for you. I'm going to send the URL address to www.blade.com. Don't look at it. Don't hit the link. Just send it to Mike. Now, Mike and Jim had offices right next to each other, and Jim was in his office with a bunch of salespeople, and all Mike could hear was, ew.
What was it?
It was a porn site. Ended the debate.
Blade was out.
It's gone.
You know, we all look really smart in hindsight, right? But let me do an excerpt here from your book, and then we can talk about why they came to the conclusions that they did. RIM decided to sit out the convergence dance. Lazaridis didn't buy into the idea that the handset race would be won by smartphones combining computing, phone, and internet services. To him, that made no sense. All-purpose operating systems sucked batteries dry, hogged wireless bandwidth, and were awkward to use with their tap-and-write touchscreens or full shrunken desktop keyboards. In hindsight, like, they just got that wrong, right?
They did. At the time, he was right. And to understand this, we can look at this and say, boy, he sure didn't get it. But at the time, you have to understand the history here, which is a very fast one. Mike succeeded with the BlackBerry because the networks, the data networks at the time were primitive. They were like country roads. And his genius was creating these packets that went across the system that conserved the bandwidth. And he was a conservationist, traditional conservationist. When he first got the iPhone in about 2008, 2009, he took it apart and said, they put a Mac in this. It's nonsensical. This will clog the lines. The calls will drop. Nothing will work. And he was right for those first 2 years.
And
remember,
they run out of batteries too fast.
They ran out of batteries. They ran out of bandwidth. AT&T couldn't handle it. But you know what I think the biggest lesson I learned from doing this book was that it's not the innovation that succeeds. It's how you change the rules of the game with innovation. And what Steve Jobs did in 2007 when he introduced the iPhone was he brought on stage the head of the cellular communications for AT&T. They got an exclusive 5-year contract to sell the iPhone, which made all the other carriers nuts, and gave AT&T a huge incentive to invent billions of dollars in networks that ultimately were able to carry the load of what Mike thought was nonsensical.
Changed the rules of the game.
They did.
They did. Here's another excerpt from the book. Because they did do well. In 14 short years, you write, Lazaridis and Balsillie had steered RIM from the obscurity of a small Ontario city to claim the title as the new kings of technology with an inventive smartphone that was a must-have status symbol for professionals. Contrasting personalities that might have driven Lazaridis and Balsillie apart during the stressful fight to survive instead united them into a stronger force against RIM's adversaries. By its 2006 fiscal year, the company's revenue exceeded $2 billion. Did they look unstoppable at the time?
Absolutely. They were unstoppable. Even when Steve Jobs had introduced the iPhone, they were then a $20 billion company. I mean, this company that started above a bagel store in Waterloo has taught us that you can create a $20 billion global company. Where they ran into trouble was that while they were scaling to keep up with that incredible demand internationally in India, Indonesia, you name it, they were hot, Africa, their foundations were being eroded by Apple. And
did they not see that threat when it presented itself?
By 2009, 2010, they could see it. But what do? Do you go to your board of directors and say, this thing that's worth $20 billion, we're going to have to drop it and focus on something completely different? We're going to have to take the wrath of the stock market for backing away from this $20 billion market? These are tough calls. Yeah. And the board was not a very strong board in the sense that they had limited technology experience. They were seasoned Canadian businessmen and women who really didn't understand technology or Silicon Valley. And between that and Mike and Jim, it made the decision that needed to be made in retrospect very difficult.
Beyond that, Jackie, they got into some real big-time trouble. They got dinged for hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for patent infringement. They got dinged by the Ontario Securities Commission for cheating to take excess profits, backdating some of the
stock options.
The stock options, that's where they were. What happened to the Mike and Jim partnership as the sky seemed to be falling in on them?
Well, this is where the story becomes Shakespearean, because you have this great partnership, this great success. Two men who didn't particularly enjoy each other's company outside of work became horribly divided over the stock options scandal. And each of them has their own perspective. Each of them has their own sense of betrayal. The upshot is that Mike had to go before the SEC to be interrogated and face the prospect of yet another humiliation after the patent case, which you referred to. And he blamed Jim, who oversaw the financing and the stock option decisions.
So Jim thought he threw him under the bus.
Jim felt he was thrown under the bus. Not only that, he said he felt that Mike didn't appreciate all that he'd done for the company. And this is what happens when you got your back against the wall and you've been like the Stanley Cup team for 6 seasons in a row and suddenly you're bums. It becomes very hard to hold the best of relationships together. They fell horribly apart. You ended up in a situation where the company was run by 2 CEOs that really didn't speak to each other a great deal, and 2 silos and 2 groups of people that are trying to make either Mike happy or Jim happy. And so when you've got to pivot and change to adjust to the communication, and both CEOs have a different idea, Mike wanting to keep the handsets and Jim wanting to move into, SMS 0.2, the texting, the BlackBerry, instant messaging that became very big a couple of years later.
EVMs.
Right.
Yeah.
So who was the board going to back? The guy that got fingered for the stock options scandal? The guy who was, had a tough personality? Or the guy who made the handsets that they loved?
The Storm was supposed to save everything.
Yeah.
What happened with Storm?
Storm was the phone that Verizon wanted. It wanted to have the iPhone killer. And so they were the big carrier, and they anointed BlackBerry to create the iPhone killer. And Mike went down to New York with BlackBerry Bold, which had yet to come out, and said, this is the way of the future. And they said, no, get rid of the keyboard. And they were looking at the greatest opportunity of their business career. And Verizon said, give us this phone in 2 months. We want a touch screen. They'd never done that. They didn't have the applications. They were about to launch the Bold and a bunch of other phones as well. So they had to do this within 9 months. And Mike's idea was, we want to create the tactile experience of a BlackBerry so that when you click the touch screen, there's actually a little pivot underneath and you can hear the click. And that decision made sense at the time. When they machined these phones, they worked, but when they mass produced them, it was a disaster. I believe the return rate on these phones was 99%.
99?
Yeah.
They sent them out, 99% of them came back.
And they knew they were sending a flawed phone. They were late getting it out. Verizon was ready to cancel the order, and the rest is history.
They also tried to compete with iPad with a little, what do they call it, the Playbook?
The Playbook, yeah.
That didn't go well either.
No, think of this in retrospect. They raced to be in that business. They saw tablets as a future. They had now understood screens. They'd learned from Storm. They launched the Playbook without the native email application. And Mike, to this day, thinks that makes sense because you didn't have to have 2 separate plans. You could have your Playbook, tether your BlackBerry to it, and away you went. Well, the average person that loved BlackBerry is going, well, where's the app that connects me wirelessly to my email? It wasn't there. And that was sort of, one of the last nails in the coffin in terms of the public perception of the reliability of this company and the great sense that they were cutting edge and ahead of their time.
That was Mike's bad call. Jim's bad call, I guess, was not appreciating the just explosive desire that the public had for ever more applications to go on the device. So BlackBerry really doesn't run that many apps anymore, does it?
It does, but to be fair to them, there was a reason that they had that mindset, and that is that when they were starting as with the carriers, they were starting with Bell South and a number of other carriers at very limited networks, and their preoccupation was crashing and the networks going down. So they wouldn't let them have apps. And BlackBerry used to put sneaker apps in when they would do software upgrades. And they would light up the system, more traffic would go through, and they would get phone calls from the carriers who ruled the world. Steve Jobs called them the 4 orifices because you couldn't get anything down their pipelines without their permission. And Steve Jobs rewrote the rules. And created one of the greatest wealth transfers of all time away from the carriers to Apple, which is now many times the size of all the carriers together.
Yeah. Let's focus now on the denouement of this story. Eventually, Mike and Jim are asked to leave the company. How did that go down?
They would say they left on their own volition, but it was pretty clear that Jim wasn't getting any traction for his idea of moving into instant messaging. He was frustrated and angry, stressed to the max. And you think about it, they had one bad thing happen after another. They had the NDP patent scandal, the stock options. Do you remember the 3 days when there was no BlackBerry? When there was the global outage?
Yep.
That was devastating, devastating. So they had all of that happen. And the board wasn't on Jim's side. The board was leaning towards Mike. Mike stayed with the company as sort of a senior advisor to the company. They replaced the CEO, and Heinz, the new CEO, moved directly into creating another iPhone killer. And Mike was furious. There was no keyboard. He felt betrayed. And when he resigned, he actually left, went to a store in Waterloo and bought up all the BlackBerries he could because he thought they would never be there again. There's really a poignant story of the human toll that these kind of ups and downs have on the individuals at the top.
What is the nature of their relationship today?
They don't speak to each other. I think they sometimes see each other at social functions, and they're very cordial. Mike is focused totally on the Perimeter Institute, the quantum physics, the University of Waterloo. He has given a great deal of his fortune back to the science community in Waterloo. Jim is a big philanthropist as well. He has his own business interests, but he, I think, is enjoying life, backing his personal interests, such as the Franklin expedition, art, and a number of other areas that are of his interest.
Balsley Center for Foreign Affairs, I guess, at the university there as well?
Yeah.
Do they have any connection whatsoever to BlackBerry anymore?
Other than they both are going to use BlackBerries for the rest of their life. Jim will say, "You have to take this out of my dead cold hands." And he uses the Bold. He doesn't want to, he's not using the new phones. He just loves the Bold.
Not a priv.
No.
He's not a priv guy yet. And that's it, eh?
That's it.
I mean, that is kind of shocking, right? These guys were so identified with this company, and now they just use the product. That's it.
This is the pace of technology today. The race is always being run, and who's up front can end up trailing the pack pretty quickly.
Indeed. How about the Passport and the Priv? Those are sort of the two newest entries by BlackBerry into this market. How are they doing?
I don't think they're doing that well. I think they're meeting expectations. The reality is that this company is slowly, inevitably moving away from handsets. The Priv is a very good phone. Had BlackBerry introduced this instead of the Storm, even a year later, waited a year or whatever to deliver it, it would have done very well for them. I think it would have been a different story.
They've got the keypad back now.
They do, and they have a working touchscreen and a really good, a browser. So the experience is very good. But I think people are moving on because are you going to make an investment in a company like this when you're not sure that they're still going to be in the handset business? They are moving into software, the Internet of all things, in cars and other applications, which is where the race is right now.
Jackie, let's just finish on this. I think you touched on this earlier, but let's flesh this out a bit. You've told the story really well, you and Sean, your co-author. I mean, it's a great story. I'm not surprised at all you're the best business book of the year for 2016. What's the ultimate lesson we need to take from the rise and fall of BlackBerry?
I would say there's two lessons. One is you can build a $20 billion in the technology race in Canada, and that is something we shouldn't lose sight of. We're all hurting, feeling that our patriotism has been damaged by their collapse. The other is they're still alive. They were very conservative. They didn't take on debt. They had close to $5 billion of cash in the business, so that helped them survive in a way that Nortel didn't and other failures haven't. And the other thing is, and this is the sort of the BlackBerry effect in the Waterloo region, which is a technology hub. All those thousands of people who lost their jobs, many of them are running their own startups in former Research in Motion buildings and moving ahead, and that is the way of the future. And that is really a reflection of our investment in universities like the University of Waterloo, their advanced computer science programs. We have the ability to do this in Canada.
Understood. Losing the Signal, the spectacular rise and fall of BlackBerry. Jacquie McNish and Sean Silkoff are the authors. Jackie, great to have you here at TVO again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.